Hey folks, welcome to the channel Thinking Theology. I'm Don. I am looking at a topic. It's not quite a hot button topic, but it can be, certainly in fundamentalist circles, when you mention the word philosophy. And it comes from people's aversion to the notion of philosophy. Comes from Colossians 2:8. There's a verse in there. I'll read it. It says, "Beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ." So fundamentalist Christians automatically say, they hear philosophy in any context and they say it's bad. Well, let's take a look at what might actually be said in that verse, what a broader meaning or understanding or a better understanding of it might be. Then you decide. First, it helps to define our terms, all right? The word philosophy itself, etymologically, means love of wisdom or lover of wisdom. Philo, love. Sophia means wisdom. Okay, so a lover of wisdom. Now, we're supposed to be lovers of wisdom, right? Like when we, Proverbs 4:7, among many others. Wisdom is the principal thing, therefore get wisdom. So the notion that philosophy itself is bad would just be improper. So what is being spoken about here? Are there specific philosophies, perhaps, that the writer of Colossians, which may or may not have been Paul, have said that's bad? What is the allusion here? What's being spoken of here? Right? Because keep in mind, in this verse, you've got other things like vain deceit, traditions of men. Now, these are independent of philosophy. So they're independent items, individual items, if you will, being spoken of, subjects being spoken of, after the rudiments of the world. So with philosophy isn't as much, and I was a philosophy major in college, and we didn't learn so much what to think as how to think. We first learned to find the problems with our own arguments, our own positions, the weaknesses in our own arguments, and that helped us be more accepting of criticisms or critiques of our own arguments from people who disagreed with what we were saying. In many ways, it just made us seekers of truth, however you want to define that, or understanding better, in the sense that we're more a good philosopher is more agreeable to hearing other thoughts or challenges to their own positions, because you're schooled literally in that. So philosophy in that regard is a very good thing, where you learn to consider things that you might have missed. And that is a sign of wisdom. Okay, when you meet somebody who has this comfort with what they don't know, and they're not so defensive, they're very fun to talk with. You just feel welcome in their presence. So one perspective on this verse is that, let's say Paul was the writer of this, which there is some debate about that without going into it. But no matter who the writer was, let's say it was Paul. He seemed to be trying to keep, like, the Christian movement was new at the time. Paul was the major primary promulgator of it about 20 years after Christ was crucified. Then Paul started to preach Christ. And so it was a new movement at the time. And it may have been that Paul didn't want the recent Christian converts, from Judaism typically, to become too distracted by the philosophies that were present at the time. Now keep in mind, it is very well known that Paul himself studied philosophy, the Greeks, the ancients, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and many others in Athens, which was in Greece. That was sort of like the intellectual capital of the world, and became that. Geneva and other, different places became the quote-unquote intellectual capital of the world, depending on how educational and academic movements took place. But that aside, Paul seemed to be saying, he might have been saying, look, just don't get too bogged down in philosophies, that, all the various philosophies that might move you away from your time spent understanding the message of Christ. That seems to be partly what was going on here when he said, don't get carried away with vain deceit, whatever he's referring to there, or the rudiments of the world. and pressures that take place. Just try to keep yourself focused on Christ. He wasn't saying to stop thinking. He was actually saying to continue thinking, but think in this way. And by and large, most folks were illiterate at the time. So it's probably 95, maybe 97%, various estimates. Very high percentage were illiterate, couldn't read. So he was sort of saying to the uneducated, or those that couldn't, don't get carried away by other people who might confuse you. Try to keep your mind focused on the message of Christ and Him crucified. That's the message, by and large, of Paul. And so he may have been saying, keep it simple, stupid, kind of thing. So, now, let's come to today, where most people in first world countries anyway are educated on some level. And many people graduate high school, many go on to graduate college. And the foundation of the educational system, much of it is based upon Greek thought and logic. And it just pervades our legal system. It pervades so many aspects of society and thought that we even can't get away from it if we try to. You can't sort of distill out the philosophical notions from Greece and other parts of the world, the French and whatnot. You can't take that out and have our society still stand the way it is. It's part of how we think and process things. So it's part of a Western education to have Greek thought embedded in it. And it's not a bad thing. We are learning to think, how to think. Now, one of the problems in the educational system today, for example, that people have is that people are being indoctrinated. Students are being indoctrinated in what to think as opposed to how to think. And that is one of the benefits of studying philosophy is you're taught how to think. When a professor oversteps his or her bounds and tries telling you that this philosopher was right, or this philosophy is right, they've overstepped their bounds in my estimation, because now they're governing your mind as opposed to teaching you how to think and then you deciding for yourself. So Paul, or the writer of Colossians, would not have been saying, don't have detailed thoughts on things. Actually, the more he wrote, the more he was saying detailed things. So he was into detailed thought. But he may have been opposing the Stoics and Epicureans, who were mentioned in the New Testament as philosophies that he encouraged people to stay away from. The Stoics were pretty chill people, put it that way. They didn't believe much in emotion or getting emotionally carried away with ideas. So they were relatively unaffected by societies or a culture's emotional movements. Now, the Christian movement was an emotional movement. Anytime you're opposed by broader society in something, you've got to be emotionally invested in what you believe in order to continue to stay with it. You do have some emotional investment in it, just like you do in a relationship with a new woman or a new guy. Like when you get in a relationship, there's emotion involved, and it would be with something like this, a new movement of the Christian community. But the Stoics were difficult to read, and we tend to like to be able to identify people, even if they're not wearing a uniform. You like to identify how they think. In today's world, people want to know, are they, in America anyway, are they Democrat? Are they Republican? And you sort of look for signs in the way they speak about things, if they're sort of buttoned down about it. But with the Stoics, they were difficult to read, so you couldn't tell if they'd be a Christian, if they were a Jew, if they were an atheist. You wouldn't necessarily know because they weren't emotionally invested. But Paul didn't like that approach. Paul was very emotionally invested in his way of approaching his version, if you will, of Christianity. And the Epicureans were likewise fairly chill, but they also leaned more toward atheism, in a sense that they didn't believe that the gods or God interfered in the affairs of the human race. They just thought they were up there somewhere doing whatever they do, but didn't intervene in the affairs of people. Now that stands in contrast to Paul, who believed that Jesus appeared to him on his road to Damascus. But the Epicureans were of the mindset, if you will, that we should just sort of sit back and enjoy the ride as it's handed to us in life. So, and that the gods didn't have much to do with it. And so that would have been very upsetting, where Paul, the gospel writers and others were like, pray constantly or consistently. And here's how you should, Jesus, here's how you should pray. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, all this. Like, it was very much about the involvement of God in the affairs of men and women of the human race. So in Colossians, in that verse in 2:8, where it mentions philosophy, it wouldn't be saying to stop thinking. The whole point is to engage the thinking mind. But it would have been like, stay away from particular philosophies that might distract you from the message Paul was preaching, which was the messianic nature of Christ. Like the Messiah had come, risen, and crucified. That was Paul's message. So naturally, he would have wanted to deter people from pursuing, especially the uneducated, from pursuing a course that might take them from that. So it's a bad precedent for anybody to encourage others not to think. And so those who say, well, look here in Colossians 2:8, it speaks very poorly of philosophy as a general concept. That's just self-defeating, really. You want people to think. You want to make good arguments. You want to reason well. This is all a function of logic. It doesn't have to be formal logic or symbolic logic, but we all do try to make sense. On some level, anyway, we should be trying to. So anyway, that's a little bit of food for thought. This one dovetails perfectly as an ideal candidate for the channel's theme of thinking theology. I like to engage people in thought, in dissecting different arguments, presenting other perspectives, and then, of course, you decide as it suits your life, your needs, your desires, your proclivities, and I hope it helps in some way. You think better, or however you want to word it. So there you go, folks. Leave your comments. I read them. I'll do a video if you come up with a good question as well. So have a great day. I'll see you on another video, and keep thinking theology.